Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more overly sarcastic productions, and this time we are hitting up the newest trope talk, Noodle Incidents. Now, I had to look this one up to be sure what the fuck it was, because I don't think I've ever really heard to it as referred to as Noodle Incidents, though after looking it up, I am aware of this trope and have seen it before. Um, I personally am not too much of a fan of it. I mean, in like children's shows and whatever, it works for me. But like in say novels, the novels that I typically like to read, and the novels that I also typically I like to write, I am not a fan of it. I want to know the information, or at least I want. For me, these kind of noodle incidents, kind of break the immersion a bit in depending on the story. I think in Dungeons and Dragons, I think it works. Um, uh, but only particularly if, say, it is with a player character, someone at the table misses a week, and the DM just writes them off as having like getting bamf somewhere, and then the player character comes back the following week and is like, "Oh man, you guys don't want to know what I went up to. I had to do or whatever, right? There was a dinosaur and a noodle, and oh man, there was one big can of tomato sauce. You don't want to know more than that, right?" That that works in that particular setting. I do not believe it would work if, say, the DM were to have an a one of the NPCs say it, right? And then of course I think it does work in comics. Comics. I think the most popular one is fucking that one comic with, what's the name? Calvin and Hobbes. Um, I think this is where this comes from. I think she used that in the thumbnail. But yeah, I don't think this works in terms of really outside, and really even in a children's show, it's okay. Not again, but like maybe once or twice per show in total. Um, but yeah, in like a book, I don't want it. My writing, I don't deal with it, so I may not have much to say here. With that rambling done, let's go ahead and dive right in.
This video was sponsored by Campfire, no relation to the s'mores incident. Okay, I can explain. This is one of the tropes with a weirder name, but as soon as I start describing it, you're gonna get the picture. You know
Yeah.
that thing where in order to show that two characters have a storied
Tell me this doesn't remind you of the rebellion on Cedarblad 214. These guys look amphibious to you.
history together packed with hijinks and shenanigans, they'll start talking about some thing
Has Star Wars done this? I feel like Star Wars has done this, but then what ends up happening in Star Wars? Wow, alright, less than 4 minutes in and I mentioned Star Wars. Alright. I feel like Star Wars has done this, but then what ends up happening in Star Wars is that that event is then later explained.
thing that happened off screen, and they'll be vague about it because they were both there and know what happened, so they aren't just going to drop any convenient as you knows for the audience's benefit. So it's basically like an in-joke they aren't sharing with us. You've 100% seen this before. This is the you and I remember Budapest very differently thing. A noodle incident.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good example. I mean, okay, I guess. I mean, oh, this is hard. Um, because I mean, in the instance of Black Widow and Hawkeye, there, and you and I remember Budapest very differently with the setting and the characters themselves. Since I feel like the Avengers movie gave us a pretty good understanding of those two characters and what they have kind of been through. Um, that that line, we kind of do have an understanding, a decent, I think, understanding of what happened in Budapest. I think we can draw a pretty good, we can infer pretty easily what might have happened in Budapest. Is it also kind of played off as a joke? Yes, but also in the same vein, because of what we see those two do, I think at the start in that movie, remembering the movie right, because I think that's where we first meet Hawkeye. Right, like I think that I feel like a Noodle incident has to be something that you don't really have a good understanding of. Um, it's something that it's very much super vague, and you can't really exactly guess as to infer what might have happened there, right? Because of our understanding of the characters during that movie, I think we can infer. No.
Incident is a wacky hijink that the characters reference but do not explain, and often if pressed for explanation, they get defensive or change the subject so the mystery is preserved. A Noodle incident might even become a running gag if enough characters bring it up, but it'll always be through hints and tidbits,
Don't make it a
usually
running
focused
gag,
on the
please.
characters' emotional reactions and not the specific events they're reacting to. In general, all we know about the Noodle incident is how the characters feel about it and one or two pertinent details about the most relevant nouns in the key event. This trope is very widespread, and it's an interesting little nugget because it's storytelling by way of implication, and on paper it feels a little bit wrong or empty to have a character hint at some exciting past adventure and then not show it. It's a joke that implies a punchline rather than having a punchline. And I've previously complained about stories that imply they're doing something exciting or clever and then fail to live up to it, like implying they've plotted out some grand and complicated mystery that ends up not having a grand resolution. And when laid out in
Wow, wasn't The Detective the last Trope Talk I watched? Because it's been a couple weeks since I last recorded.
the broadest strokes, this feels like another case of that. But it isn't, because in this case, the fact that the Noodle incident is never explained is the entire point of the bit. The trope is called the Noodle incident because of a running gag in Calvin and Hobbes, where it is repeatedly implied that Calvin did something horrible involving noodles that had the potential to get him put on Santa's naughty list. Bill Watterson decided against ever explaining what the Noodle incident was because nothing he came up with would be funnier than what the audience imagined. This principle of comedy is
Yeah, and again, like that works for Calvin and Hobbes because of the genre and type of story that Calvin and Hobbes is. It works for that story. Again, I feel like Noodle incidents work best for things that are more catered towards children. Calvin and Hobbes is more catered towards children.
basically the funny haha version of the horror movie principle.
And again, nothing wrong with that. That is just how our storytelling has how we as humans enjoy our stories. As children, we like things a certain way. We, in general, like things a certain way, and as now older, we like things a different way. Some people, of course, are different and may still find a lot of enjoyment in things that are reminiscent of the stories that they read as children. That's totally fine, right? Stories are stories. They're all valuable in some way to someone out there somewhere. Damn, I feel like that's a pretty good quote. One of those kind of dumb quotes that actually makes sense, right? One of those quotes that you look at it and you're like, this shouldn't make sense, but also it does make sense. No? I feel smart.
Of not showing the monster. The terror the audience imagines from the tiny hints of danger and the overwhelming power of the unknown is always scarier than whatever the special effects department could rustle up, and the Noodle incident is the comedy invocation of this same idea. The line between comedy and horror is thinner than either genre would like it to be, and this means that if a writer plants the right set of hints, they can cue the audience into entertaining themselves by contemplating the implications of what the story is hiding from them. In the case of horror, the hints are danger.
Well, also there are comedy, like one of the tricks that comedy does lean in on that now and again, where they're kind of building up tension for something, and then what ends up being what would traditionally be like the jump scare, or the resolution of that building up of tension, comedy cuts it at the ankles, right? And it becomes right that tension is released through laughter. That's what comedy like. Yeah, comedy and horror are very much. There's a thin line there.
fear, unexplained noises, movement in dark corners, threats in places you thought were safe. In comedy, the hints are absurdities. The phrase "the Noodle incident" tells you nothing except that it was an incident that involved noodles. We can put on our Sherlock Holmes deerstalkers for a minute and infer that whatever role Noodles played in the incident was more prominent than any other participating element in order to get the incident named after noodles, but really all that tells us is the incident was probably food being used in a manner inappropriate for food. Calvin made a mess is nowhere near as funny as contemplating the implied horror of what he could have possibly done that could only be described as the Noodle incident. Noodle incidents are very efficient at communicating information, but it's pointedly not the information about what the Noodle incident was. Noodle incidents are not about what happened. It's the way they are talked about and described that's basically a characterization speedrun. For one thing, they flesh out a character's backstory and make it clear to the audience that they have adventures in a life off-screen and aren't just chained to the camera 24/7, which does a lot to make them feel more alive. But the bulk of the information the audience gets from a Noodle incident comes from how the characters act when they're talking about it. The way they react to the sparse, vague hints we get gives us a ton of information about the character. They describe or briefly flash back to an unknown incident in their past, and how they choose to describe it or not describe it tells us something about them. Maybe they're speaking really casually about something that's implied to have been a very dangerous scenario, implying that they are ridiculously badass and blasé about the dangers in their life. Or maybe they're bragging about something they pulled off in a very self-aggrandizing way that sounds suspiciously exaggerated, implying that they're kind of a glory hound. Or maybe they're acting very mildly annoyed about some vaguely defined grievance that sounds absolutely bizarre, which tells us that they're way too acclimated to some really weird shit. Or maybe they keep starting a story they're clearly passionate about and getting shut down, making it clear that the people around them aren't being particularly considerate of them right now. And on that note, the way their fellow characters react to them referencing the Noodle incident gives us even more information. A character who reacts to a Noodle incident reference with extreme defensiveness was probably the butt of the joke, whatever the joke was. A character might shut down the conversation because they've heard about the Noodle incident too many times, making it clear that somebody in the group really likes talking about it. This kind of thing can play out in so many different ways, and because it's basically just free-form dialogue that the writer can drop in anywhere there's a quiet moment, it's
talking about that scene from Star Wars.
A character might shut down.
How many of those kids are dead? So far, I think the only confirmed one to still be alive, well, Ahsoka counts, because she is a child in this. Ahsoka and Gunji are the only two confirmed to still be alive.
Down the conversation because they've heard about the Noodle incident too many times, making it clear that somebody in the group really likes talking about it. This kind of thing can play out in so many different ways, and because it's basically just free-form dialogue that the writer can drop in anywhere there's a quiet moment, it's really narratively efficient for getting across characterization in a very short span of time. One show that does this a lot is Leverage, which seems to have gone out of its way to deliberately leave a lot of the characters' adventures off-screen to make them feel like complex people who've lived exciting lives. In the very first episode, it's mentioned that former insurance investigator Nate has personally chased down every other main character at least once, and those adventures are never ever shown in anything more than a few seconds of out-of-context flashbacks. You'd think the first time the characters met back when they were still on opposite sides would be kind of an important story beat, but it isn't. None of the characters care to bring it up when they could be focusing on new adventures instead. Showing a flashback to a first meeting wouldn't really add anything to the story. And the formula for later episodes follows a similar principle of only hinting at events between episodes or backstory bits by showing or telling us out-of-context goofs. We'll get little bite-sized flashbacks of Parker throwing Hardison off a building or Elliot getting waterboarded or something, and when it flashes back to the present, the way the characters react makes it pretty clear that all of these things are very normal for them and not really worth dwelling on, although their friends might disagree. And it might sound like these are stories the audience might be curious about seeing in the actual show, but what makes the balance of Leverage work is that these Noodle incidents are pretty much par for how the actual episodes go. We never really feel like we're being cheated out of the Parker steals the Stanley Cup episode, because we've got like 7 seasons of stuff exactly like that. The Noodle incidents just make it feel like there's more show happening in the background of the show. In horror movies, the scariness of the story often takes a rapid downturn after the monster is fully revealed for the first time. Sometimes this has to do with special effects not holding up, but mostly it's just from the simple fact that almost all fear is grounded in the unknown, and once the audience gets a clear, good look at the danger, it's not unknown anymore. It can still be scary, but it...
Which is also kind of sometimes... I think sometimes when the monster is revealed like that, it could also end up being part of the point. So I think this rarely happens most of the time. I feel like in horror, in scary movies, is when the thing gets revealed, they want it to still be horrifying. But I personally think that like once it's revealed, kind of part of the point maybe should be that isn't as scary as you once thought it was, and now it's something you can handle, right? And that could be a sort of poignant message about fear, but that's also me and my own particular storytelling tastes.
It won't be as scary as it was when the audience was imagining it as their own personal worst nightmare. Alien is straight up terrifying until the very last scene, which is also the first time we get a clear, bright shot of the alien in question, and it becomes very apparent that it's a guy in a well-made suit. Thankfully, the reveal is saved till the very end, and on rewatches, the movie still holds up if you know what the alien looks like, but it takes away some of the highly specific horror of how well it blends into the environment, and how the characters have no idea what to look for when it gets big. And Noodle incidents face the comedy equivalent of the same thing, because despite the fact that Noodle incidents are—
But I think in regards to Alien, I think that being the moment in which the alien is revealed to us works, because it was, as I was saying, once it's revealed, it is not as scary. And at the same time that the monster is being fully revealed to us in Alien, we're also, our protagonist is yeeting it out of the space station, right? She's winning. She's succeeding. She is outsmarting it. And I think that is the also then the in that story the best time to have also the full reveal of what this alien looks like, because she has conquered the fear of that alien, essentially, right? She has beaten it. So I think in that instance, it actually enhances um the horror in a way. Um, right? Like the reveal is intrinsic to the story being told, you know?
entirely built on not explaining the joke, some stories do anyway. And this explanation usually happens because not all Noodle incidents are actually funny. For instance, sometimes characters reference serious Noodle incidents to highlight how badass they are,
Not
either by
it,
bragging
trademark.
about some vaguely defined accomplishment or referencing some vaguely horrifying element of their formative tragic backstory. A character with a storied and exciting past full of too many adventures to ever show can pretty much always allude to some exciting and cool thing they did one time. And as long as it lines up with the competence the audience has actually seen from them in the episodes that did get made, it feels like a plausible Noodle incident without needing clarification. Of course, you also get—
Again, I think this also comes the way in which Noodle incidents are gonna work is if your character work is strong enough. And also your world building. I think it ties into it as well. So I guess in this, like I was being too perhaps narrow in my own definition of a noodle incident. Um, so yeah, I think a noodle incident, you gotta have your strong characterization. The audience has to understand the character so that they can then understand the vibe of the noodle incident and have that noodle incident work
get cases where a character
for the
brags about
audience.
stuff they did off screen that doesn't really line up with their actual on screen characterization, which might indicate that this character is lying or exaggerating, or that the writers are hiding all the exciting adventures in the off screen zone for some reason. But tragic backstory Noodle incidents are in kind of a weird zone. Comedic Noodle incidents, as discussed, are basically a funny invocation of a horror trope, storytelling by implication to let the audience fill in the gaps with their own imagination without bogging down the story with too many lengthy explanations. In fact, since a lot of comedy is built on characters being distressed, a comedic Noodle incident might be played for laughs, but actually be describing an event that sounds unpleasant at best and horrific at worst. And if a writer takes those implications and plays them straight, they get tragic Noodle incidents which invert the horror to comedy inversion and loop back around to just being horror tropes. If a character briefly and vaguely alludes to something they went through that sounds tragic or nightmarish, it serves the same purpose as a typical Noodle incident.
Oh shit, I did this. I have a line. Oh well, there are. Damn. I mean, I just kind of consider that world building at that point because you don't have the time as in what I again, I don't know. I don't know if I would count that as a noodle incident. I just kind of consider it at that point just kind of character work and world building. Which I mean, I guess if you really want to be as broad as possible with the term of a noodle, what a noodle incident is, that's kind of essentially what a noodle incident is. It is character building, character slash world building in one. I don't know. Ooh, I am conflicted.
Providing a highly dense chunk of characterization just through the way the character refers to the event without ever having to specify what went down. And it signals to the audience how this character feels about their backstory and how much they want to share. For instance, in typical Noodle incident fashion, if they never clarify or they shut down follow-up questions, it might indicate that this slice of backstory is, rather reasonably, a sore spot they don't want to talk about too much. But unlike a typical comedic Noodle incident, these more serious teases of emotionally nuanced backstory elements might actually invite a clear explanation. A dark or upsetting element of somebody's backstory could potentially be important and require that the character actually tell the audience what specifically happened. Sometimes these reveals even reframe a Noodle incident that previously seemed lighthearted and comedic by revealing that the vagueness of the references to it were concealing the real emotional weight of what went down. If a Noodle incident is hiding an actual plot-relevant event, it kind of has to eventually get cracked open and explained. But this is pretty rare. Most Noodle incidents are jokes that don't need to be explained, and like all jokes, would be less funny if they were explained. This actually segues into an interesting tangential principle that applies to a lot of stories, which I like to call, fans don't actually know what they want from their stories. The entire
Thank God. Someone said it. Oh. You see this so many fucking times, right? When Mass Effect 3 came out and then like the years following, right? A lot of a good bit of the talk was that people no longer really wanted like they're like after Mass Effect 3 Shepard's story was done and people were no longer really wanting Shepard's story, and I think a good amount of people were wanting to explore the wider galaxy outside of the Milky Way, right? Now, of course, I was way too young to really be a part of that discourse, so I could be wrong here with my generalized statements. But essentially, Andromeda is Andromeda is everything that the audience said they wanted from the next Mass Effect game. BioWare gave the audience what they wanted, and the audience was like, no. I'm sorry, the audience doesn't know what they want. Let the storytellers write the story. Like, the amount, oh my God. This TikTok has made this so fucking noticeable. The amount of people that just should not be telling stories, are not good storytellers. And it's fine. It's fine. Remember, you don't have to be a good storyteller. Not everyone is made for it, right? Um, Storytelling is a profession. I would argue one of the oldest, if not the oldest profession in human history, because they were the storytellers are the ones that would remember the stories of group, the tribe, etc. Right? They would tell that to the next generation, and so on and so forth. Right? Storytelling is hard. The audience doesn't know what they want. Let the storytellers do the storytelling. You don't know what you want. Like there will be people that'll talk about like I got no good examples off the top of my head, but I'm sure it wouldn't be hard to find people like this coming up with like what if they should have I don't know, you see this like in Star Wars a lot. How they should have done this, or like Dave Filoni should have done this or whatever. And I have problems with uh the live action Star Wars shows. I don't Most of them I do not think are very good. I enjoyed maybe like Andor is like really the only one that I consider genuinely good. I think it's quite frankly a fantastic piece of storytelling. Um, but in terms of Ahsoka, there were a couple episodes where I was like, damn, that's good television, and the others I was just like meh on. Mandalorian, I really only thought season 1 was good. They fucked up season 2 was good on release, but then they fucking ruined it retroactively with uh the 2 Mando episodes in the Boba Fett show, and having Mando get Grogu back fucking right away. Right, they completely ruined the impact of the season 2 finale. Um, so yeah. Um, but you'll see people online coming up with their own like, you know, alternate universes or ideas or whatever. And you're like most people, obviously, if you're not actively a writer and you're maybe not actively reading a bunch, you'll just look at that and go, yeah, that sounds pretty neat. If you're a writer or you read a lot, you'll look at that and you'll be able in your mind to kind of fill out the bigger picture, and you'll be like, no, that would not work. Anyways,
core principle of a Noodle incident is that
I
it
guess
gives
I
the
have more to
audience
say
just
about
enough
Noodle incident
information for
than I
them to
thought.
speculate and extrapolate what might have happened. Whether that extrapolation is in the dimension of comedy or horror depends on the planting and how the characters frame it. By its very nature, a Noodle incident piques the audience's interest and makes them wonder what happened. But foundational in the trope is the simple fact that the audience's loose speculation is more entertaining for them than a clear explanation would be. Essentially, this trope entertains an audience by making them wonder what happened. But if the audience then asks the storyteller what really happened and the story decides to tell them, the wave function collapses into certainty and all that fun speculation and comedic vagueness goes away. The Noodle incident just becomes a little flashback within the story. And this
goes into essentially also the world building advice that you will typically see is it's called the tip, like you do the tip of the iceberg, right? Have these you say these things, and there are then certain elements of your world building that you do flesh out in greater detail so that the audience can look at these things and be like, okay, there's detail there. This thing is kind of left up in the air because it doesn't really serve a point to the purpose of this story, but because you as the writer kind of established here, I wrote this in detail, this bit of world building, the audience will assume that there is more to the stuff that was left shallow because it likely did not serve a point or need to be explained further for the purpose of that story that you're telling, whereas this bit needed to be explained deeper, and this bit you could get away with just not saying much on it. That's literally everyone does that. Every writer does that. And every writer should do that because you cannot fucking flesh out your story. Even Tolkien did it, right? Like, as much as we say Tolkien was a perfectionist, and he fucking was, and he wrote out a shit ton of stuff, he also changed a shit ton of stuff all the fucking time. And so I can't think of any good examples off the top of my head. But he definitely did it in Lord of the Rings. That kind of stuff. So, yeah, the audience sees this much of the iceberg, but then their brains will make the assumption of there being this amassed underneath the water.
Confused storytellers. The fans spent so much time clamoring to know what happened, and then we showed them and they seemed disappointed. This is kind of what screwed over Solo a Star Wars.
Exactly. And honestly, that because of Solo, that was my fear going into Andor. I was like, why we don't need to hear about Andor. And I think the difference between Solo and Andor, Solo is a fun heist movie. I think it is actually a genuinely good movie, but there's no depth to it. There's no import. It is just a fun movie, and I think fun movies should exist. But maybe not to the level that Solo was. Maybe not for a character like Han Solo, right? I think a lot of the fun of Han Solo's character is the mystery of Han Solo. Andor, I think what Andor does is it deepens parts of the Star Wars universe that were already fairly deep, or at least they were intrinsic parts to the Star Wars story, right? The Star Wars story is anti-imperialism, the fight for democracy and freedoms, right? The fight against tyranny. And so, and Andor does those tropes, follows that storytelling, those storytelling beats, it takes that into, it's essentially that in its entirety is about essentially another part of the rebellion being begun, right? Because again, rebellions aren't just like these organized things. Andor is complicating the rebellion, and showing like, hey, right, this stuff doesn't just happen. It is messy, and there are a lot of moving parts and differing, bickering factions inside of rebellions. Um, but that doesn't make them any less, valid or whatever. I don't really know how to explain it, but it's just Andor is just so good. It had a message that it wanted to get across. Solo had no message.
Star Wars story, a completely passable movie whose entire purpose was explaining every single Noodle incident Han Solo referenced in the original trilogy. It lays down in canon exactly what he was talking about when he said they did the Kessel Run, or that Chewie hangs out with him because he owes him a life debt, or that he won the Falcon from Lando in a game, and you can almost
Yeah.
hear the writer's room clapping themselves
The only thing that it didn't do was the how he ended up in debt to Jabba, I think.
on the back because they've figured out how to give the audience the fan service they demand, because fans have been speculating about the Kessel Run for decades. Won't it be so good for them to finally see it? And we can
Yeah, the Kessel Run was like I didn't mind the reveal, like how Chewie and Han became buddies. That one was fine. I think that one fit. Um it fit the two of their characters, but the Kessel Run I think was the Kessel Run was something that should have just been left ambiguous.
finally stick it to those people who keep pointing out that a parsec is a unit of distance by explaining how that actually made sense all along. People are gonna love this movie. After all, it's what they've been asking for years. Solo kinda heralded the current era of Star Wars content where everything feels pretty intensely focus grouped to give fans what they think fans want from playing to the averages, and that means every time they explain a Noodle incident, it ends up being basically the average explanation. Solo is a movie with no surprises except for how good that one explosion looked. And I probably liked
True.
that movie more than most people. I mean, for one thing, I actually watched it, which is already kind of a big step. And for ages, the best thing I'd had to say in its defense is that it's exactly what I expected it to be. It hits every beat you'd expect from a Han Solo origin story. He checks off every box from his backstory, has a gunfight where he shoots first, gets all his equipment in order, and flies off into the sunset with all the stars going whoosh. We even get to see Chewie rip a guy's arms off. On paper, this is a nice and tidy way to give fans the answers to every question they've been asking since Han first rocked up on the silver screen in 1977. There's only one problem. A gold-hearted street-smart scoundrel like Han Solo should not be a character with all his questions answered. He's had a long and complicated life causing problems and getting into scrapes. The reason
And I think another part of the problem is when we meet Han Solo in the movie, he is still going through a character arc, right? Or well, kind of his character arc kind of starts in episode 4. He's scummy in episode 4, and then by the end of A New Hope, he's kind of he's a good guy essentially by the end of A New Hope. And then the problem that then having a prequel movie on Han Solo is um hey, uh we can't you gotta get Han Solo can't really it's not we don't really want to see, like, especially a character like Han Solo essentially regress, in their arc, because essentially really the end of the Solo movie, that Han Solo is not beginning of A New Hope Han Solo, right? And of course they had supposedly planned more movies, but because it bombed, they're not gonna make it, which I think kind of sucks. I thought Alden Ehrenreich did a fantastic job as a young Han Solo. It's still a story that did not need to be told. Um, but yeah, how that Han becomes this Han doesn't add up. Whereas in Andor, right, Andor kind of starts off, he is very much for the rebellion. He is just a bit kind of cynical on it. And so the course of Andor is we watch Andor essentially become uh he's becoming radicalized to the rebellion. He starts off like not at all really wanting to get involved. He just wants to survive. And his character arc is becoming involved in the rebellion one way or another. Um and becoming attached to that. And then his character arc continues in Rogue One, where it'll end, where he kind of stops being as uh, cynical and um, kind of understands, like, there's it's not at, like, he tries to then, like, I think in Rogue One, he essentially is trying to he explicitly states, and he's an example of, the rebellion is gray, but then he himself does not view the Empire as gray. He views every single person that works for the Empire as pure evil. What Rogue One does is, hey, the Empire is bad. The system of Empire is awful. But then there are people inside of that Empire that do want to take down the Empire, right? Like Jyn Erso's dad, who is forcibly being forced to work, even though he is an intelligent man, right? And seemingly in a position of power, he is still being forced to do something that he doesn't want to do. And that essentially, like, it essentially becomes, I personally believe, the lesson that and Cassian learns by being with Jyn in Rogue One. That's his arc in Rogue One. That the Empire is also gray in some ways. The people within the Empire that work for the Empire, they're not all bad. Kind of. It's hard. I don't know how to explain it. It makes sense in my head, but it's something that I feel like I just can't word.
And he has so many Noodle incidents in the first trilogy is because he's had the most convoluted life out of our trio of protagonists when contrasted with Princess on a Mission and Farm Boy who's never left his zip code. And this is signaled by him constantly referencing things that he and Chewie have done in a way that implies he's been doing a lot of stuff. The fact that we don't know his whole story and he's been up to a lot of sketchy shenanigans is kind of foundational to his vibes, and it makes the twist of his character work where he shockingly does not abandon the good guys and instead gets himself in a lot of trouble doing the right thing for once. Han is a pretty simple character, and he's written pretty efficiently in the original trilogy, and the fact that there's a lot of vagueness in his backstory is a feature of his archetype, not a bug to be corrected. Now, when Han mentions the Kessel Run, the audience doesn't go, ooh, the Kessel Run, that sounds interesting and space-related. He must have gotten up to a lot of fun high-speed adventures. They go, oh yeah, I remember that part of the movie with the thing that lives near black holes but isn't immune to black holes. The Noodle incident trope illustrates one of the more counterintuitive parts of storytelling, and one of the parts that I personally have had the most trouble internalizing. Sometimes it's better to not explain something. The bones of the story need to be pretty solid. Setup, payoff, key backstory elements, explanations to hyped up mysteries, but outside of that core space, there's a lot of room for vagueness and flexibility and implication. Noodle incidents are characterization tropes. What happens in them almost never matters. It's how the characters feel and talk about them that's the real meat of this trope. To drop in a quick MCU example, one of Nick Fury's most interesting lines back in the earlier phases was, "Last time I trusted someone, I lost an eye." Nick Fury's eye patch is an iconic part of his character design, but up to this point, it's never really been focused on or addressed directly in the movies, and Nick Fury is not the kind of person to volunteer information that isn't need to know. So when he drops that little tidbit, the takeaway isn't, oh man, I wonder what specifically happened to make him lose that eye. It's, oh man, so Nick Fury has been profoundly betrayed by somebody he trusted in a way that literally scarred him for life, which is probably part of why he's so ridiculously cautious and overprepared. He sure has been through a lot of stuff that tempered him into the ludicrous badass he is today, somebody who would never make that mistake again. It's a characterization cue. No explanation for his missing eye was gonna have the same impact on the audience as just hearing him talk about it. And especially not the explanation they actually gave us. And that's actually pretty illustrative of this point. When they finally showed us how Nick Fury lost that eye, it was a joke, and it tacitly disproved all those juicy characterization implications we'd inferred from that first reference. Profound betrayal shaping the young Nick Fury, a reminder of his own past weakness staring him in the face every time he looked in the mirror. Now all we get from it is that he probably doesn't like cats very much. A Noodle incident is basically narrative sleight of hand.
I'm not as much of a hater on the Captain Marvel movie as I think a lot of people are. I thought it was fine. I just don't think they the way I personally believe Brie Larson is a great actress. Fucking what? Didn't she win an Oscar or she been nominated? I think she won. At the very least, she's nominated. She's a talented fucking actor, but that script and probably the director telling her how to play the character, it was not the vibe. Those aren't, and of course there's probably a conversation to be had around like, well, if it were a male character, it probably would have been more acceptable to the general audience. That's a valid thing that's a whole other thing to talk about, which is valid. Um, but also personally, what I like in my protagonists, I don't like that kind of protagonist that Captain Marvel was in that movie. I um I prefer, you know, a Captain America kind of protagonist.
And it looks like it's showing the audience a fun hint of a hidden adventure, but through the execution of that hint, it's
Or
actually
a Falcon who, well, he's now Captain America. Which, by the way, MCU, Marvel and Disney are doing him dirty. They have promoted the fucking alternate reality uh, Captain Britain more so than they have the MCU's Captain America, new Captain America. Like, why you doing my boy dirty like that? Sam Wilson, come the fuck on. He's like, out of the characters left in the MCU, he's probably my favorite. Now that, I mean, Thor was written horribly in that last Thor movie, Love and Thunder. I love Thor and Ragnarok and Infinity War. Um, but really, the only character I think there are only two characters that I think I can definitively say that I enjoy still, and that would be three. Spider-Man. I'm kind of souring on Spider-Man a little bit, just from overexposure, I would say. Spider-Man, Sam Wilson, um, and Bucky. Um, they're essentially the only characters left around that I genuinely care for. I'm just like, I like Loki, but like I don't like time travel stuff. I
teaching the
don't.
audience what
I
kind
watched
of
season 1.
person
I'm
the
not gonna watch
character
season 2.
is. And then, if the writer decides they want to show how the trick was done, the trick stops working. There's a lot of merit to leaving things loose and unresolved when it comes to character backstories. If it's not foundational to the comprehension of the story, it doesn't need to be set in stone. We don't need to see exactly what Han Solo did to piss off Jabba the Hutt. The only part that matters for the story is that he did piss off Jabba the Hutt, and now our heroes need to deal with the consequences. And when we examine this uncertainty principle, a term that definitely has no other more confusing meanings, we can loop this back to horror again. At the end of the horror movie The Thing, when the Arctic base has burned down and the creature has theoretically been destroyed, there are only two survivors left, protagonist MacReady and engineer Childs, who had previously disappeared and was presumed dead, but claims to have just gotten lost in the storm. Given the whole conceit of The Thing, it is entirely possible that that is not Childs. Hell, if you squint, it's technically also possible that that's not MacReady. The ending is brutally ambiguous. Maybe our two human survivors have a chance of making it, or maybe the only human survivor is about to die in some horrible way, and the thing in question is just gonna freeze itself into hibernation again. There's tons of theories and speculation about it, but fundamentally, it doesn't have an answer. That's what makes it work. No explanation would be as effective as the impact of not having an explanation. I do feel the need to go off script and clarify just a little bit that it takes work to create a story wherein no explanation would be as satisfying as the impact of not having an explanation. Because this is like the root of that mystery box form of storytelling that I think is absolute bullshit, because it's like, if you're telling a mystery, the entire point of the story is the resolution of the mystery.
Yes.
That is pointedly not a case where a lack of explanation is more impactful than an explanation. If it's a mystery, we want to see it solved. Okay.
Right can't think of any good A Song of Ice and Fire examples of what doesn't need to be explained off the top of my head, but but I think two examples that do need to be explained is probably the origins of the White Walkers. Now, we don't need it as in depth, but we do need to, because George is known for his complex character work and complex world building. I think we do kind of need to find out what the origins of the White Walkers are in order to defeat them. And I do think we need further explanation on Rhaegar and Lyanna's relationship. How exactly did that work? Now, of course, there is a sizable age gap between them. Rhaegar was a full-blown adult, and Lyanna was a 16-year-old girl, and one Rhaegar, right? So there's a bit of problematic there, though. Of course, in the medieval feudal society, her being 16 was kind of also probably seen as being an adult. So to them, they probably wouldn't see it as problematic as us of our modern day do. But right, Was she kidnapped? I think largely where we are now in the story, it is mostly assumed that she was not kidnapped by Rhaegar, instead was a seemingly willing person to go along. But we don't, that is, none of that is confirmed. That, I believe, is one thing that needs to be confirmed, the relationship between Rhaegar and Lyanna. How exactly did it work? That kind of stuff. But like Daenerys and Viserys's escape, how they escaped from Westeros, fled and managed to stay hidden from Robert Baratheon. Though of course Robert kind of knew where they were, he just didn't go after them until, didn't feel like he had to go after them until Daenerys was betrothed and wedded to Khal Drogo. Blah blah. But we don't need to hear an in-depth explanation as to how uh how Viserys and Daenerys escaped. We don't need an in-depth explanation as to how, uh, as to what really happened in the sacking of, um, like King's Landing or whatever, and what the mountain that rides, did to, um, uh, Elia and her children. We can infer. We don't need the details, right? The details are not necessary, though. Of course, some characters do provide further details, but they still leave it pretty somewhat ambiguous. Like, I think it's kind of left ambiguous as to what the mountain did to Elia and the children is probably worse than what the characters tell us, is my assumption, right? That sort of thing. Like, that stuff doesn't need to be explained in depth. Those are the only things I can think of off the top of my head.
That's it. I'm done. We're good. Bye. So yeah, and thanks again to Campfire for sponsoring this video.
That was where we end. That was Trope Talk Noodle Incidents. This went way longer than I thought. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.